Thank you very much, and it's really great to be invited to speak about what's on the box. Do we have informed consent for direct-to-consumer testing? So I'm going to be considering this question, and I'm going to be drawing on some work that we've been doing in Birmingham, so in particular a cross-sectional study where we looked at direct-to-consumer tests within a 10-mile radius of the University of Birmingham in 2023. So I'll be reflecting on this question and giving some examples from what we found in this research. So what I'm going to be doing is just briefly outlining the size and shape of the direct-to-consumer test market. What do we mean by direct-to-consumer testing? And then considering whether the extent to which the direct-to-consumer testing market supports informed consent, whether information provided is trustworthy, whether safety is protected by ensuring people are not misled or coerced, and whether they're equipped with the knowledge to understand the implications, the benefits and harms of the choice to test. And then I'll just be sharing with you my thoughts about what further action is needed to support informed use of direct-to-consumer tests going forward. So first of all, the size and the shape of the DTCT market. First of all, just to define what we mean by direct-to-consumer testing, there are different modalities depending on the level involvement of the consumer. So for self-testing, which is what I'll be talking about today, this is where the consumer initiates testing, they decide to test, they take the sample, they process that sample, and they interpret the results themselves. So familiar with doing that throughout the COVID pandemic. There's self-sampling where the consumer makes the choice to test, they take the sample, but then they post that sample away, and that's processed by a third party, results are sent back. And then direct access testing where the consumer has the least involvement, they initiate testing, they make the choice to test, but all other aspects of the testing process are done by a third party. We've heard already in the conference about the sort of increase in the direct-to-consumer testing market, both globally and in the UK, and its diversity. So you can test for wellness, you can test for illness, vitamin D, genetic tests, and all the way through to cancers. And the growth in that market, I think, is underpinned by what I've described before as a perfect storm. So we've got a health system in crisis where demand is outstripping supply, with increases in waiting lists, with health policy emphasising prevention rather than treatment, and a move from care in the hospitals to communities, all of which are potentially coherent with the use of direct-to-consumer tests. And then we've got market forces. We're now familiar with using self-tests, and there's the convenience and the privacy and the autonomy offered by self-tests. Effortless and efficient, our home health tests empower you to take charge of your health right from the comfort of your home, be it screening for bowel cancer, opting for a discreet at-home STD test, or assessing your prostate health. Our top quality kits deliver swift, dependable results, says Dr. Hilary Jones. And this is all on the backdrop of a regulatory landscape which is in transition. So both the EU and the UK IVD sort of regulations have been in transition since 2017. That transition period has been extended because of COVID, for the UK because of us exiting the EU, and because of pushback by manufacturers because of the complexities and the increased demands that are likely to be placed on more stringent regulation for them to get their tests to market. So, a really sort of slippery landscape in the background. And I'd just like to play this TikTok video to you, which I think summarises really sort of nicely where we are. Any sound?
You can do your own UTI test. You can do HIV testing. You can do FOB rapid test for faeces. You can do FSH rapid test midstream. You can also do an allergy test, How cool is that? You can also get an iron deficiency test. You can get a cholesterol test. You can get a, not have a clue what that is, but you can get one of them. You can get a stomach ulcer test, and you can also get a vitamin D test. How cool are these if you want to diagnose yourself? Because let's be honest, you can't get a GP appointment these days, can you? So you can come down to your local Tesco and pick up a test. Any free for £2, any free for £2 as well. So you're well covered, aren't you? Come self-diagnose yourself at Tesco. You can still get COVID tests as well.
We'll come back to the microalbuminuria test later. And the responses to that sort of TikTok post were largely that, well, you know, it's sad, it's amazing, but it's sad. This is privatisation in the UK being privately introduced. This is because we can't get appointments with our doctors. And I think we just need to remember that there is a role for direct-to-consumer testing. There is, you know, HIV self-testing, I think, is a success story. It's allowed people at risk who are underserved to access testing, and it's been shown to increase uptake and detection of HIV. But you know, there is legitimately concerns about the rapid growth in the DTC market and concerns about the impact on public health and the health system if it's inadequately regulated, and we're not prepared for it. So I'm going to be looking at whether we have informed consent for the current DTCT market, thinking about whether the information provided is trustworthy, as said before, whether information is ensuring that people are not misled, coerced or uninformed, and that they're equipped with the knowledge to understand the implications of their choice to test. So if we think about whether the information available is trustworthy to start with, the regulation of medical devices is based on risk, and the risk associated with the device is defined as the probability of the occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. So far, so good. And theoretically, the higher the risk, the more stringent the evidence requirements for regulatory approval. So if we take the UK medical devices regulation, for example, there are 4 categories of risk. Self-tests are defined in their own category by virtue of the fact that they are conducted by people at home. Looking at that list, if we had a self-test for HIV, that would be the highest risk test by virtue of the fact that it's testing for HIV, not just because it's a self-test. As part of the cross-sectional study that we did in Birmingham, we tried to get evidence for the 30 direct-to-consumer self-tests that we looked at, which covered most of the range of the tests that I presented on my earlier slide. And we actually were only able to get hold of evidence for 12 of the 30 tests that were on the market. And we subjected that evidence to quality assessment using QuadAS2. For those of you who are not familiar with the quality assessment of diagnostic studies tool, fairly intuitive. Red means then that quality indicator is not present. Yellow means that there isn't information for us to judge whether that indicator of quality is there, and green means that that's the quality indicator is there. And as you can see, for the 12 clinical conditions, for the reports that we found, there's not very much green, and there was particular concern around the way that participants were selected. So this is evidence that's underpinning estimates of performance of these tests. We're particularly concerned about the way participants were selected and the tests that we used to verify the accuracy of these direct-to-consumer tests, so what we call the reference standard. So ideally, the reference standard should be a better test than the test that you're evaluating the accuracy of. This is one example of a study report for vitamin D, I'd just like to draw your attention to several things. The first is that the vitamin D rapid test cassette, which is the test that's being evaluated, is on the left, and it's being compared to another rapid test. It's not being compared to a lab test, it's being compared to another rapid test. So already we're a little bit concerned about the reliability of this research. this study. The overall estimate of accuracy is 94.4%, but actually there's only 7 people with vitamin deficiency, D deficiency, in this sample of 90, of which the test only detected 4, so it missed 3. So the positive predictive value of this test is about 57%. So that accuracy estimate, that overall accuracy estimate of 94.4% is misleading. We'll come back to that. But this is the type of evidence that we were faced with for the tests on the market. And what we realised when we were doing this research was that assessment of conformity, so the evaluation of that evidence and the level of evidence that's required, so the more risky the device is, the more stringent the evidence requirement, that the manufacturer self-declares the risk of that test. So they say what the intended use of the test is, that then determines the risk and how stringent or the level of quality the evidence is required, the evidence that's required. And that the information that manufacturers give to these bodies that assess these tests is commercially confidential. So the public don't have access to it. We were very lucky, I think, by accident we're given this information, but it's not publicly available. So I would suggest to you that the CE mark, or the UK CA mark, which is the mark that's given to tests that have undergone this process, is not an indicator of quality and certainly isn't any kind of standard. So I would suggest that the information underpinning the performance of these tests is not trustworthy. So let's move on to the next condition then, which for informed consent is whether the information that's provided is ensuring that people are not misled, coerced or uninformed. So one of the things we did was we looked at the readability of information for use leaflets. And this, going back to this microalbuminuria test here, what we did was we compared the readability of the information for use leaflets inside the box with Harry Potter books and the Green Cross Code. One of the indicators of readability we used was the flesh reading score, and the lower the score, then the less readable the information is. And just as a guide, a score of between 70 to 80 is equivalent to something that's sort of readable by school-aged children, 13 to 14. And 20 of the 30 tests that we looked at had flesh reading scores of less than 70, so quite difficult to read. An extract from the IFU for the microalbuminuria test is at the bottom of this slide. And I think you probably agree that that doesn't look like it's very user-friendly. Moving on to the content of the information in the box. So the majority of the 30 boxes, tests that we looked at, lacked any information about the clinical application of the test on the box at the point of sale. So is this test for screening or diagnosis? And perhaps more important for the kind of audience we're talking about is whether any indication for who should use the test was indicated. So is that to do with risk factors, people of a certain age, people with symptoms, for example, and only 2 describe contraindications to using the test. So there was really very little guidance about who these tests were for. And then looking at the kind of language that was used, we had boxes that said they were screening, bowel health tests, and then if you delved a little bit deeper, this was a test that was going to look for colon polyps. And then actually this is a test that's one of the potential clinical conditions that it's looking for is bowel cancer. And similarly for this test for prostate health, something which maybe consumers would be more familiar with, the prostate-specific antigen. This is for prostate cancer. And you could see how manufacturers presenting this kind of information to notified bodies Are they seeing a prostate health test, so a self-test, which is a lower risk category, or are they seeing a test which is a test for cancer? So it may not just be consumers that are being misled here. The other thing we found was that there was quite provocative language that was used. So this is the vitamin D test again, and the sort of long list of health risks that apparently are associated with vitamin D deficiency. This is manufacturer information, osteoporosis, osteomalacia, multiple sclerosis, cardiovascular disease, pregnancy complications, diabetes, depression, strokes, autoimmune disease, flu, different cancers, infectious disease, Alzheimer, obesity, and higher mortality, etc. And then we also found tests where consumers were being encouraged to repeat the test if the test was negative. And you can see how, what should I do if the test result is negative? Around 25% of tumours, this is a bowel health test, do not bleed constantly. For this reason, it's important to test yourself or arrange to be tested annually from the age of 40 at the latest. And again, this is the prostate health test, which is encouraging consumers to test regularly between the ages of 50 and 75 years old. We also looked at whether the information provided about direct-to-consumer tests for consumers, about their intended use and what actions consumers should take afterwards, was coherent with evidence. And we found that for 11 of the 19 conditions covered by the 30 tests, the intended use as marketed was contrary to national and international evidence as we assessed it. Only one of the tests that we looked at, and that was the COVID test, is actually endorsed as a self-test. And we judged that 7 tests for 7 of the 19 conditions. The test use was coherent with guidance, but not without healthcare professional support pre- and post-test. So I would also suggest that current direct-to-consumer test market is not safe in that it's not ensuring people are not misled, coerced, or uninformed. So what about information to understand the implications of the choice to test? First of all, in terms of how well the test performs, what's the accuracy of the test, and therefore what's the benefit and harm of doing the test in terms of test errors, the tendency for the test to make errors. 20 of the 30 test boxes didn't provide any information about quantitative test performance on the test box at the point of sale, and all of those that did expressed test performance in terms of accuracy, which in itself doesn't provide information about the value of a positive test result separate to a negative test result. So it assumes equal weight is given to false negatives and false positives. And of course, that's not the case. So a false negative for a vitamin D test is not going to have the same consequences as a false negative for a fecal occult blood test, a bowel health test. And for this particular test, which was again is looking at fecal occult blood, false positives were not very transparently discussed in the limitations section of the IFU. So the bowel health test will only indicate the presence of fecal occult blood. The presence of blood in feces does not necessarily indicate colorectal bleeding. As with all diagnostic tests, all results must be considered with other clinical information available to the physician. So I would also suggest that the current direct-to-consumer test market does not provide consumers with information to understand the benefits and harms of the choice to test. So what action is needed to support more informed use of direct-to-consumer tests? And I guess, as always, we've got to think about this balancing autonomy and safeguarding in, empowering individuals with trustworthy, understandable information and then how much do we need to actually think about restricting access for safety reasons. And some of the action that we've thought about that might help in this landscape in terms of safety is raising awareness, not just with the public but professionals, about the potential harms of testing generally. I mean, I don't need to tell this audience that. But also the poor quality of most of the direct-to-consumer tests that are on the market at the moment. I think we need to sort of rethink the risks associated with self-testing and the limitations of regulation to ensure the safety of use by tests by consumers. Should we be thinking about over and behind the counter sales for devices on the market in the same way that we do for pharmaceuticals? And maybe endorsement of high quality self-tests by respected bodies. Providing trustworthy and understandable information, so harmonisation of pre-market evaluation and post-market surveillance standards, so translating legislation into guidance for manufacturers and for notified bodies that is transparent about what a good quality study looks like and what potential, what causes harm from testing. And co-creation of standards for advertising and labelling with manufacturers, with regulators, with the public, and also minimum requirements for instructions for use. And we are undergoing regulatory reform, certainly in the UK, so following the Cumberledge report in, I think it was 2021, right, first do no harm. Again, this was mentioned right at the beginning of the conference, I think, from harms from vaginal mesh. So, and we're expecting regulations will strengthen requirements for manufacturers around technical documentation, clinical studies, particularly those underpinning studies for self-tests, and clearer requirements for those bodies that are assessing a conformity assessment for manufacturers and awarding whatever replaces the CE or the UK CA mark. So regulation is moving in the right direction. And similarly, the EU, so they're looking at reclassifying risk, devices, risk classification, but we're not expecting EU regulation to, the transition to have completed for self-tests until 2029, so we've got quite a while to go yet. So some of the answer, maybe, for regulation. We're seeing the WHO endorse self-tests. So these are tests that have been assessed independently by the WHO. We could perhaps have something similar here for other public bodies. National Screening Committee, nice, perhaps. The NHS. And we have advertising, packaging and labelling guidance for pharmaceuticals. So why not for direct-to-consumer tests? And again, the WHO seems to be starting to lead the way here. They've just published this guidance, rapid diagnostic test accessibility considerations for professional use and self-tests. Currently, this is what it looks like for devices. So in terms of advertising, medical devices are subject to general laws regarding consumer advertising only, and the language on the left, the information on the left is what is in the medical devices regulation around information that needs to be provided within a device. And you can see it's not very helpful, comprehensive. And also working across interest holders together, so not working in silos. We've got a research project that's funded by Cancer Research UK, working across all of these interest holders to try and understand where the sort of tensions are between regulatory reform, the need for higher quality, and excessive cost, delays and complexity for manufacturers, to try and foster a joint understanding and a shared way forward. Because the NHS at the moment is suggesting that if you want to do an HIV test, self-test, then if it has a CE mark, it should be fine. Thank you.